Welcome to the Mediate Your Life podcast. I'm your host, John Kenyon. In this second episode with Sarah Peyton, we continue exploring the intersection of neuroscience, nonviolent communication, and conflict transformation. This time, we dive into the emotion circuits mapped by affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp and how these circuits relate to my Mediate Your Life framework. From anger and fear to shame and authenticity, we unpack the neurobiological foundations of conflict and healing, both personal and collective. Along the way, Sarah shares her deep understandings of the social and political dynamics shaping our world today. In the final section of the episode, I share a difficult current experience that I relate back to a traumatic time in my childhood. Join us for another profound journey into the inner workings of the human brain and heart. All right, I am back with Sarah Peyton and feel so happy that you're willing to have another kind of follow-up conversation with me, Sarah. So hopefully people will have watched that as a kind of more of an introduction to you if they're not familiar with you already. And today, the reason why to let the audience know why we're back is we want to some things we didn't get to last time, which is to talk about my Mediate Your Life framework, the idea of a map of the territories of conflict, and in these different territories, different processes, and in each one, it has its own type of conflict, whether it's inner or outer. And to overlap that with Sarah's some work I learned about through Sarah of a affective neuroscientist, Jaak Panksepp, who I believe has been very, very important to you, Sarah. But anyways, maybe we could even start with that. But anyways, we're going to talk about that overlap of Sarah, your and my work, and then we're going to also try to somehow weave in what's happening socially, politically right now, because we're both very interested in that level of our human challenges and the traumas that we experience related to that level, and the social justice and injustices that we are, hoping that our work will contribute to a better social world, a more loving and caring and just and sustainable, ecologically sustainable world. So, that all being said, welcome back, Sarah. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you again. And would you like to start off a little bit with Jaak Panksepp and him particularly, and how he has influenced your work?
Yeah. Well, I ran across his work as I began to study interpersonal neurobiology with Dan Siegel and Bonnie Badenoch, and also with Alan Shore. And so Jaak Panksepp at that time was still alive in the 2000s, and he just died about 4 years ago now. And he was speaking at interpersonal neurobiology, relational neuroscience conferences. And for the first time in the 2000s, he was getting the kind of interest and respect that his work really deserved, because his work is amazing. He took he was the one who discovered that rats laugh, that that we share with mammals these pathways that our emotions and motivations travel upon, and that we, like mammals, have a play pathway where laughter lives, and it's got its own neurotransmitters, and it's located in its own part of the brain, in a whole different tract of tissue that I call circuits, a whole different circuit than Jaak Panksepp called them systems, a whole different circuit than the rage pathway, which is an entirely different pathway and does different things to the mammal body, and has different neurotransmitters that are running it. So sometimes I think of these different pathways for different emotions kind of like a bus map in a city with different bus lines having different kinds of buses on them. That one bus line has a diesel fuel bus the buses that run on it, and another line runs on biodiesel, and another line runs on gas, and another line is a hybrid, and another line is electric. And that's sort of what these circuits are like inside of our brain. They're very different. They give us different feelings about what's going on, and different levels of energy and motivation. And so his work was so exciting. And in the 20th century, his work was almost completely disregarded by other neuroscientists and not quoted, because in part what he was discovering was that the results of lab tests done with lab animals changed depending on the relational quality of connection that the researchers had with the animals. The outcomes were different. And this was throwing all of animal science, animal-based research, into question. And nobody wanted to quote him or talk about his findings. And he was excluded. He was kind of scapegoated and excluded in the scientific community. And when you see speeches that he did in the 2000s, when he started to get airplay, you can hear this bewilderment in his voice and in his words about not having been included and celebrated for the beauty and creativity and significance of his work. And indeed, he died quite young. He died, I think, age 63 or 64. And I think, this is what happens to mammals when they are excluded. Their health is compromised. And so I believe that we lost him early because of this experience of him being excluded in his professional community.
Wow, I did not know that part about his story. Wow. And I didn't know about his findings of the relationship with the researcher.
He was discovering how profoundly we are changed by relationship.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, maybe let's just dive right into how I've experimented with mapping that onto my work, and then we'll just kind of riff off that. So let's start there, and then we'll see how the larger the happenings of the larger world maybe we can weave in. So in my Mediate Your Life framework, there are 10. I've called them 10 maps, but really it's one map of I call the world of conflict, and that it has these different regions and territories. But in each region, in a way, there's like kind of a sense of how to navigate with a compass and some directions, and having a kind of orienting to, where am I in the world of conflict? And there's two that are very, I call it getting grounded, the region of just getting grounded. So a self-connection process, and a speaking listening process that's, pretty just my way of framing nonviolent communication in a kind of basic way. But then there are these territories, and I'll just take one at a time, and I'll just tell you how I've tried to map on Jaak Panksepp's emotion circuits. So one is the compassion for other, I call it, and in NVC we call it enemy image. Having enemy images, but it's basically how to mediate internally, but empathy for self and empathy for other, and then out of that inner mediation of the empathy of self and other, then to create the emergence of new possibilities for connection, but also for taking action that would, support meeting all those needs that we get in touch with for self and other. And of course, I'll start with that one because that's the more obvious, like the anger rage circuit, right? So when we're when we're experiencing the kind of conflict where we're judging other people, and we're feeling a lot of anger, say, towards them. It could be other emotions too, but like when we're particularly, it could be frustration or irritation or rage and hatred, right? That whole spectrum. But I was thinking like that so clearly is like what Panksepp was, that circuit. And then there's also, Panksepp talks about the care circuit, right? That the like the attachment bonding circuit, right? Basically of mammalian care and caregiving. And so it seemed I've thought about framing the work, or it's sort of shifting. I want to check with you if this makes sense neurobiologically, but that as we give empathy to internally to ourselves and others, that we're shifting out of the rage circuit into the care circuit. Yeah, starting with care for ourselves, and then care for other, and then creativity of solution from there. So, any comments so far on?
Yeah, a couple. So, Panksepp said the only healthy way to mitigate rage is with love. That is the way that rage gets managed, is with love, is by linking it to love. Like, and not just who do we love, ourselves or others, but what do we love? Like, I mean, I've been struggling with the Supreme Court and the way that the Supreme Court has taken, folks on the Supreme Court have taken money and gifts and appear to be voting in accordance with the gifts that they've received. And I have rage, and I love, I really love the original system of checks and balances of the United States system. And if the Supreme Court justices are voting according to gifts they receive, then we've lost this huge possible sweetness, that I love. And so there we are. There's the rage, and then mitigated by the love for justice and balance and fairness, which is not a word that some NVCers enjoy that much, but it's very neurobiologically sound.
Yes.
And so there's that. That's the first thing. The second thing is a very interesting piece of what you have to struggle with in mediation, and what I have to struggle with in trauma healing, is that judgments are often cold rather than hot. So when the emotion is hot, that is rage. Although there can be like withdrawal rage, where people pull away instead of going toward one another, but that can still be kind of hot. The coldness is really interesting. It comes in with contempt and with judgment, and that's predatory aggression. It's on the seeking circuit, but it's the seeking circuit being kind of co-opted by our hunting instinct in a way, and it's driven by dopamine. So when people, neurotransmitter, what's neurotransmitter P for rage? I can't remember in this moment the neurotransmitter for rage, but it's not dopamine. It's a different neurotransmitter. And so when people are doing judgment, they're reinforcing, they're running their reward circuit, which is different than rage. And so then we have this interesting struggle to bring empathy and bring people into their aliveness instead of into the kind of dead dopamine reward driven sort of cycle and recycle of judgment and resentment and bitterness and envy are all kind of, and contempt are all kind of running there in that area.
Yeah, let me see if I get that in a way there could be two circuits related to a judgmental reaction to somebody. One is the hot anger, rage, and the other is more the cold kind of just disconnect in a way, and that's even linked to predatory behavior in a way.
Yeah. And then there's a third, which is disgust, which Panksepp did not include in his circuits. He was asked to include it in his systems before he died, and he refused. But in the years since he died, more and more research has been done, which makes me believe that it qualifies as one of his systems. And one of the things that makes me believe it qualifies is, it really is very connected to serotonin. So it's got its own neurotransmitter. It's got its own regions in the brain that light up that are different than other regions with other emotions, and it has its own facial expressions. I mean, disgust has its own facial expression. So, so for me, it qualifies as one of the systems, and it's very powerful, especially when we're talking about social conflict. It's the most mobilized emotion used for othering, for reactive politics, for fomenting hatred of refugees and immigrants. It's a very big handle on most people's backs that can be grabbed by the media and by politicians, and then the people can be steered by their disgust.
Okay, yeah. 'Cause what's really interesting to me in this is how people can kind of self-assess. Where am I? Where am I in this world of reacting to the environment and different emotions? And sometimes often we don't know what we're feeling very well, but cues to help us kind of locate in a way, where am I? What's going on in me? What is this? So that's, just using all this neuroscience you're talking about as a way to help with that uh, of it, these three different circuits you're
Yeah,
mentioning. It could
yeah,
all in different ways being activated. And then I want to ask you about a kind of overarching understanding I have around empathy, almost like a stage sort of model in my mind that, and in NVC, we focus a lot on giving empathy through observations and feelings and needs. That this model is, again, empathy for both the self and the other. And that my sense is like empathy comes first. And we have in NVC a certain technology. And then in our last conversation, we talked about a lot of other kind of related strategies for resonance and connection in the nervous system. So empathy first. And that empathy then becomes what opens the doorway to care, to love. So it's like hard to jump straight to love, like unconditional love or something, but that if we can focus on empathy for ourselves first and then other, and then that can open up the care circuit, the love circuit. And then from there, we can get more collaborative and want to try to find a way to work together. But is that your sense too? Is it like a sequence like that? Does that?
yeah. With a little bit of interesting variation, as I've explored, here are some of my theories about empathy in these three circuits. First of all, and this is something that you said, I think, so many years ago when I was working with you, first studying with you, that anger is alive. Like, it's not, we don't have to be afraid of anger. Anger is like, needs are right there. They want to be named, that when people are angry, we're closer to them than we are at other times. And this holds true, because that link between care and love and rage is so important and so foundational. So that's in some ways the easiest place to bring empathy. Contempt and judgment and blame are more of a hard shell. It's harder to bring empathy. And often my experience is that people really need to leverage their own willingness in order to get through the hard shell. They really have to not want to be blaming in order to be able to transform the blame, because it's so
Deep and strong.
so driven by the reward circuit and happening in the instrumental brain, happening with the little short-armed neurons that don't really, rage is big-armed neurons. Rage is like, what's one of the easiest reasons it's easy to move from rage to love is because rage is big and love is big. But contempt and blame are small. And they have like these little cycles. And I have heard you transform contempt and blame with empathy. So it can be done, but it is easier when people are really leveraging their own desire for something different, not wanting to blame. And then disgust is most interesting of all because it is the least amenable to being empathized with. With contempt, so rage, we go to love. Contempt and blame cover grief, usually. Not always, but mostly. They're covering for mourning that a person cannot do. When disgust is being misused against people, it's a manipulation of fear. If blame is a hard shell, disgust is a thick, sticky mat that we cover the earth with and stand on top of. So now the best way that I found to go through disgust is to ask people to, when they're willing, of course, again, now, you've got mastery level empathy skills and can hear into what people are saying in a way that people who have not studied with you extensively maybe can't do, but are learning to do as they model themselves on you. But in terms of if people want to transform disgust, the easiest way is for them to turn it into a metaphor and to look underneath it. What is it covering? And then to make empathy guesses based on what's underneath the disgust. Then things really start to change in interesting ways. People discover very deep truths. So it's an important emotion to empathize with and to find ways to empathize with, but it's very resistant to traditional empathy.
Wow, that's so not only fascinating, but I find it so helpful what you're saying, like understanding these kind of levels of the emotion circuits, and that the anger almost to me just surprisingly like that one's the easiest empathize to with empathy that transforms it into connection and love and care, right? And then it gets progressively harder to go to contempt and blame, and then even deeper into disgust. And those are different circuits, and why you're explaining why it can be so hard to with these different emotions to experience the shift that empathy can bring and the care that can happen.
Yeah, and the problem with disgust, so the problem with contempt and blame is the reinforcement with dopamine. The problem with disgust is that it's so linked to the viscera. It's so extreme. When we experience disgust, our body internal torso temperature raises 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And it is also a dopamine reinforced experience. And this is, of course, the basis of genocide, is that it becomes rewarding to otherize.
The imagery too, usually it's very viscerally oriented imagery of labeling. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing we're mobilizing with disgust is we're mobilizing really strong in-group, out-group motivation in the human brain, which actually, weirdly enough, mobilizes the care circuit for evil.
Wait, say that again. The care circuit for evil. What do you mean?
Well, when we're encouraged to care deeply and feel bonded with and belonging with a particular group, our group, and encouraged to otherize other groups, like I'm white. My white people are going to give me a rush of belonging, of oxytocin, of regulation, of regulating all my emotions. And by otherizing other people, I can displace my aggression. And displacing my aggression decreases my cortisol. And that's also an activation of the care circuit. Decreasing cortisol, increasing oxytocin. So now we're using the care circuit, but in a very targeted way with in-group and against out-group. We get huge spikes of oxytocin. It's a different kind of reward than the dopamine reward of contempt. We get huge spikes of oxytocin with our belonging and with our othering.
With the othering. So a lot of in-group care and belonging that spikes way up as the more disgust for the other. Yeah. So it's so reinforcing chemically, right, in our body, neurotransmitter wise. Yeah. But then that can lead to the willingness to do tremendous violence to the other. Yeah. And totally cut off empathy for the other.
They're not really human. They're subhuman in some way.
Yeah, there's us that are human and good, and there's this evil, bad, and can do anything to them.
Right. And we see this with Gaza. And we see this with the Hezbollah against the Israelis as well. But right now, my concern is with the genocide in Gaza. And then we see this less in Ukraine, Russia. Ukraine, Russia is more predatory aggression, less disgust.
Oh, wow. Let me hold on. And yeah, it does feel like I've been wondering why I have a kind of a felt sense difference with these two. And often it's referenced, but it's not explained. And so you're giving a really fascinating explanation of it. Let me just say it back. So I think I got that you see what's happening in Gaza is tapping into that disgust in othering kind of dynamic. And then Ukraine, Russia, more the contempt, blame,
Blame predatory aggression.
predatory aggression.
Yeah, and really, has less contempt in it and less blame in it, but just more sort of pure predatory aggression. This is our land. We want our land. This is not your land. No, this is not my, this is mine. This is mine. It's got this different quality of territorial dispute that's not disgust based.
Ah, yeah. Wow, fascinating. This is so cool talking to you about this. And I love how you're just weaving in these. I was so wanting to do this and you're just doing it. This what's happening in the world, and we just came out of the US elections not long ago and Donald Trump getting elected, and you're kind of indirectly referencing some of this kind of making immigrants bad and wrong and evil or whatever, and just what's happening on this level of our politics and how the politics are so polarizing, and now what's being kind of given a green light to in terms of not only the presidency but the courts, as you're saying, the legislative branch as well, becoming very, very much more conservative and all that. So yeah,
Very in-group, out-group based. Even the selection of the folks for the cabinet, is all about who's in Trump's in-group. And so then he creates, circles and circles and circles of oxytocin-based, cortisol-decreasing structures that decrease stress for the people who are involved in the in-group.
is that then more? Are you seeing it primarily like the strategies that seem to revolve around him, or maybe the MAGA party? That it's more the disgust level, or is it a combination with the? No, it's the disgust level.
It's hugely based on disgust.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Wow. Okay. In terms of my map of the world of human conflict, that's one so I think of these regions. I talked about the getting grounded, then there's the kind of inner region, and this is one territory of anger towards other, but like internally, how to mediate that internally. And right adjacent to it is a territory of, I call it resilience with feedback. And it's in NVC often it's, I kind of pulled the main terms: mourn, celebrate, learn as a process to follow, to bring empathy that shifts out of, and I have for a long time thought the defining emotion of that territory when we're receiving a certain kind of feedback and it's triggering to us because we're worried about the alarmed aloneness, the panic of losing connection by hearing certain feedback that we screwed up, we made a mistake, and now we're going to lose connection, we're going to be rejected and abandoned. And that this is a way to kind of counteract that by shifting to just mourning unmet needs, and then also trying to balance it out with celebrating needs met and back and forth, and then going to the learning. We can learn from this and we don't have to stay stuck in shame and fear of losing others. But would you do a similar thing with that, like the different circuits you see going with that territory?
Yes, and I love that you've named, the fear of losing connection. But what's so cool about the panic grief circuit is that when it's in, so now we can start to talk about the nervous system states and which nervous system state of which circuit is available. So fight, flight, alarmed aloneness is sympathetic activation. Our heart rate is up, our blood pressure is up, our reactivity is up, and that's where you are with people in conflict, is often fight, flight, alarmed aloneness, or in collapse immobilization. If you're in fight with rage, you're not exactly in a very relational place. You're you're trying to protect what's yours.
Mm.
And so where we want to get in order for, and this is what you keep pointing to with, empathy and then strategy, what we want to get to is social engagement, where all of the circuits have their full expression, their full positive expression. And the full positive expression of the panic grief circuit is a consistent capacity to really mourn.
Mm.
So here we are experiencing the panic grief of receiving feedback. Now, with emotional support, we move out of alarmed aloneness into social engagement, the social engagement of mourning, where there's connection in the mourning and where the mourning flows without fear of loss. So what empathy does is it moves people from nervous system state to nervous system state. And where we get to is exactly this place then with feedback of mourning the impact of what we've done on other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I found too, it can be a different facets of mourning. There can be the mourning of others' unmet needs, and just sort of translating that from I'm bad, I did something bad, to oh no, just some needs didn't get met, and I did some things or didn't do, and I can just be sad that needs didn't get met. That's a I call that kind of keep turning the corner on that, and just focusing on, Marshall called it the sweet. Ultimately, can be a sweet pain of mourning any needs not met and how we participate in that. But then also maybe how we're receiving the feedback is maybe challenging, and the kind of mourning of our needs to feel seen or understood or loved for who we are, or something like this, the mourning of, how this feedback is occurring, or the fact that it, happened at all. And so there's going to be different ways, right, to mourn. But I hear you saying it's activating, I'm probably not going to say it right, but that the communal sense of the communal, and grief is a communal thing. And once we're in the relational communal, it's a different experience than spiraling into the isolation, right, of shame.
So different. Yeah.
Yeah. The compassion for other territory, as I call it, that you talked about before, these three levels. I thought you said something really cool about, it was the anger, the grief, and the fear, right? In terms of the three different circuits you talked about.
Anger, grief, and disgust. We haven't talked about fear yet. Yeah.
With the disgust, something about there's an underlying fear or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there can be all kinds of things. It's very interesting what underlies disgust.
But then when you're talking about this mourn, celebrate, learn process, that there, yeah, would you say it's a different circuit? It's the panic, a grief circuit. Yes.
Panic grief circuit in social engagement.
In social engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's and this is this is like living well. If we've got our panic grief circuit walking with us arm in arm, so that we can at every moment say, the world is not as I wish it were. I mourn that the world is not as I wish it were. Instead of pretending that the world is different than what it is, which is what we do if we don't have mourning walking with us arm in arm.
And so it sounds like it's really consistent with your understanding that by focusing on mourning, and it gives a way to create the healthy relationship with that circuit. That we can it's like in us to mourn that, and it is a way to kind of keep coming back to the healthy functioning of that circuit.
Yeah, and your work of accompaniment in conflict is what transforms nervous systems.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm really curious what you would say about. There's another. I think of it as going even deeper into in this internal kind of mediation realm. To Marshall Rosenberg called it chooser educator. I call it the mediating self compassion, and I differentiate. It's been interesting to figure out how that self compassion differs from the resilience with feedback. And I have had the thought that when we get to this, the need for, or the place of self-compassion and this part of us that chooses something, and then the part of us that judges ourselves. So to me, it's more like the focus is not so much on losing connection with the others, but more of how we judge ourselves harshly. And to me, it's a different quality, and it's more almost, I think of it as guilt. It's like shame is like, oh my God, I'm going to be like abandoned and I'm so bad, versus I'm beating up on myself because I feel so guilty for what I did. I didn't live up to my values. I didn't do it the way I wanted to do it. And I'm angry with myself. So it's like anger towards myself, and it's disgust maybe with myself even. So those are the things I've thought about relating to Panksepp.
Yeah. So shame and guilt have a huge overlap in the human brain. They're both cognitive distortions of panic grief. Shame, the feeling that I am wrong, is often pinned in place with unconscious contracts to blame the self in order to make sense of a difficult world. It's harder to shift, but it is in its essence distilled alarmed aloneness that we've tried to put a layer of meaning onto. We are too alone in this moment, and often we've left ourselves. So what you're talking about is the process that helps people to not leave themselves with shame. Guilt doesn't have a contract usually, sometimes, but very rarely. Mostly what guilt is, when somebody says, I feel so guilty that my brother died, we say, oh, what happens if you say, I feel so sad that my brother died? And they say, I feel so sad that my brother died. And then we say, okay, what's happening with the guilt? They say, that's what it was. It wasn't, it's gone. It evaporates very quickly once guilt touches sadness. But shame is more contract based.
Hmm.
In order to manage alarmed aloneness. I mean, so much. So it's no coincidence that the human stress hormone is cortisol, and that the main hormone of the panic grief circuit is cortisol.
Mm.
Our stress is almost always because we are not accompanied.
Yeah.
Because there's nobody with us, because we're trying to deal with so much alone, because we're trying to deal with a parent with dementia and children who need to go to school and bills that need to be paid. And, it's just, we're torn apart by the things that we really value and love. And there's not enough of us to go around, and we need support. We need people. That's what stress is. When you start to look at stress, it's being too alone. When you have stress, you can say to yourself, how am I too alone here? And it's very interesting. It's the same question we can ask with shame. How am I too alone here? How am I suddenly horribly alone with shame? So what you're talking about is this really beautiful and sophisticated movement of the prefrontal cortex being able to bring resonance, empathy, to the system as a whole, so that the judgments dissolve, so that the shame dissolves, so that and to be able to kind of create neural connections and kind of a smoothing of, it's really secure attachment is what you're talking about.
So yeah, it's been really fascinating over the years to try to differentiate. There's a lot of overlap, but between, for me, the process, it's about receiving this sort of incoming feedback and the shame that can trigger and how to shift it into what we talked about. But then when it's about mediating between the part of me that is judging myself and the part of me that did whatever I did that I'm judging. And you're saying that's the same circuit. It's like it's not a, I was thinking it's a different circuit somehow, but you're saying it's the same circuit of the panic grief circuit. Is that right?
What you're starting to touch into now is the capacity of the person themselves to be able to make decisions and hold intentions to move towards self-connection, self-regulation, connection with others. It's like the capacity of the brain to hold higher values and to act on the basis of those higher values, to act on the basis of big needs for, whatever it is we love in terms of needs. And you're talking about something that transcends the circuits themselves and moves into the cognitive area of the human brain. You're talking about the prefrontal cortex itself, which isn't involved in the circuits. The circuits are subcortical and limbic. And then we've got this kind of cap on top of it. And some of the cap moves us into cognitive processes like shame and blame and guilt and revenge and resentment and envy. And some of the cognitive processes move us into, oh, my sweetheart, you make sense. It's kind of a mobilization of the care circuit, but a carrying of the care circuit into the capacity for intentionality on this whole different level, which is what regulates human nervous systems and makes human immune systems work at their absolute tippy-top best.
So I hear you. There's things I feel like I'm not even fully grasping in what you're saying, but one thing I got is like, it's when I talk about this, what the chooser evaluator process of giving empathy to these two parts of us, the part of us that did something, the part of us that's judging ourselves. When we're really developing or practicing or really activating the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, yeah, and we're in a way that's really bringing that care circuit online and that softening and soothing of the nervous system. So you're saying it's the same circuit as the mourn, celebrate, learn, but it's
it's the same circuit as the circuit that works with disgust to make people outgroup. That's still the care circuit. The circuit that is mourn, celebrate is the panic grief circuit.
Panic grief, right? So the one that's the self compassion I'll just call it the self compassion area. That one overlaps with the disgust.
It overlaps with the care circuit.
Yeah,
it calls upon the care circuit in its best incarnation. The worst incarnation of the care circuit is not so thoughtful, not so values based. These, folks, when they go into disgust, they lose their prefrontal cortex. When they go into in-group, out-group, they lose their capacity to hold on to their higher values of inclusion for all, of justice for all, of, liberty, equality, fraternity. People when they're pulled into that incarnation of the care circuit, which we may very well call the sympathetically activated care circuit. Like we've got fight, flight, alarmed aloneness, and we've got the mobilization of disgust, which then co-opts the care circuit and makes it capable of genocide.
Right.
So, but it's the same circuit that we're calling on then when we're asking for self-compassion, but we're connected, up here. People lose their prefrontal cortex in in-group, out-group, and in disgust.
Wow. Okay, this is kind of blowing my mind. So, are you saying perhaps when we're working with anger towards other, maybe we've been co-opted to act from a disgust place to be in anger and judgment of other. A way into is the self-compassion somehow as a doorway to sort of try to loosen up when it's feeling really too hard to just directly get empathy for the other in the other outgroup.
And whenever we touch into the needs, the right hemisphere, so interestingly enough, there's research that shows that some needs activate the instrumental brain and some needs activate the right hemisphere. When we touch into the right hemisphere needs beyond the need for an in-group, then we start to get this expansiveness. And this is the cool thing with nonviolent communication is it's got the needs technology. So here we are with self-compassion starting to we're drawing on the right temporal parietal junction to be able to, create this. It's the same place that holds a sense of God, actually. It's the right temporal parietal junction and needs, it's a very important and beautiful part of the brain that gets mobilized in your work with mediation to bring more possibility to brains that have been tragically limited by sympathetic activation.
And with this self-compassion process we're talking about now, it's like, yeah, usually it's needing to start with the needs of and the empathy for the part of us that's judging ourselves. And then there can sort of create some space to empathize with the part of us that chose something that we, that we're judging ourselves for. And what were the good reasons, the needs we were trying to meet in the best way we knew how. And I think you're saying that is just so, connecting to these parts of the brain you're talking about, but that allows us to really find our highest.
Yeah, and we're transforming the default mode network, the automatic voice of the brain, which is the automatic voice of the brain is the one that carries the self-judging voice. And as we connect with self, we're actually transforming the default mode network.
I mean, there's just one maybe of this inner region. There's I call it mediating self. It's kind of a counterpoint to the self-compassion as self-direction. So self-compassion, I think, is mediating internally. Compassion, it's about the past, something we chose in the past. And then there's about choices for the future. We get stuck in not being able to move forward, reach our goals, or even know what we want. We're confused about what direction to move in. So I think of that as internal mediation with different parts of ourself that are kind of at odds and not working together to move in an aligned way towards a goal. There's so many different kind of approaches to that, and like why we get stuck and what contracts are limiting us and all kinds of, all the trauma about what blocks us from that. But in terms of just sort of mediating and giving empathy to these different parts that are trying to help us get to a future of some kind, what would you tie in there?
Sure. And I just want to highlight that we haven't touched on fear yet, which is, of course, of huge importance in human brains and hugely important in mediation.
And maybe that's in this one too. Yeah, fear.
Yeah. So then we are working with the blocked seeking circuit. And so that it's very good to do whatever needs to be done to clear the blocked seeking circuit. And as that seeking circuit comes alive, then it allows us to take action along our path. Now, knowing what our path is this other circuit that we have not talked about, which is the sexuality / emergence circuit, which is what Panksepp says is that the circuits of reproduction are the same circuits that take us from childhood to adulthood. They take us into our unique adult self. And so if we're blocked in our emergence, then we won't know where to go. We might have a seeking circuit that's working just fine, but it can't move because it doesn't know where to go. And it may not know where to go because the ability to really celebrate and enjoy who we truly authentically are has been compromised, usually by trauma. And then play is like the first circuit to be disabled by stress and unmet needs, and the last circuit to come online as we're healing. And play in our world is so often linked with aggression and predatory aggression. So sarcasm is play and predatory aggression. Teasing, rough teasing, painful teasing is linked between predatory aggression and play. And competitive games are seeking in play, which diminishes the pure quality of play. And then when we find that pure quality of play, there's that sense of enjoyment and safety. And I certainly have experienced a lot of a sense of enjoyment and safety in our connection in these two conversations. And so for me, we have the frosting of play on our experience.
As we kind of mediate empathy for the different sides of an inner conflict about moving forward towards some direction, some future, that it's both, it sounds like it's harder to activate the play circuit since that's the last one to come online.
When mediations start to go well, do people start to laugh?
Yeah.
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 You're establishing safety. You're decreasing sympathetic activation. You're moving people into social engagement. The play circuit is starting to appear.
Like, I want to contrast this inner with the outer, and actually the mediating between self and other, or between others. And I think of the fear as one of the primary things that blocks some of those difficult conversations.
Let's talk about fear, because it's a very interesting, yeah. So in the English language, we use the word fear a lot, as you pointed out earlier, to mean the fear of loss of others, or the fear of loss of connection, which has a different neurobiological constitution than fear from financial or physical or sexual safety. When our body is threatened, then there's fear. And this can be health. This can be physical danger. This can be a mountainside coming down. This can be somebody scary in the night. This can be a partner who starts drinking and becomes terrifying in their drunkenness. This can be having a beloved pet that's been injured. But then it starts to get mixed with love and with panic grief, the fear of loss. As soon as connection is also threatened, then the picture starts to become more complex, and the neurobiology of it starts to become more complex. So the neurotransmitters that run the fear circuit are glutamate and endogenous benzodiazepines. So Panksepp used to differentiate. So anxiety is an emotion that can be either panic grief, alarmed aloneness, or fear, questions of actual physical safety and emotional, physical, financial, sexual safety. So here we are with these two different circuits. Panksepp would see animals that were anxious, and to tell which circuit it was on, he would give them benzodiazepines. If they responded with calmness, it was the fear circuit, the physical safety circuit that was being stimulated. If they didn't respond, then it meant it was panic grief. If he gave them opiates, then the panic grief circuit anxiety would calm, but the benzodiazepine anxiety, the fear anxiety, would not. But what's so cool about that, for those of us who practice nonviolent communication, is that our needs words deliver different neurotransmitters on these different neurobiological circuits. And we can start to differentiate them and calm them. So you, just by virtue of the years that you've spent in empathy relationships with people, hearing them, making guesses for them, figuring out what might be a support for this person, for these words, for this tone of voice, it's like you are a walking NVC pharmacy.
Oh my God.
These words that deliver medicinal healing and restitution and renewal and restoration to human brains.
Oh, that's amazing how you articulated that, and how the needs, whether we learn it kind of implicitly or even consciously, right? The different needs almost fit into those neurotransmitter slots that open up these circuits of healthy,
they bring all the circuits into social engagement. Yeah.
It's when people are afraid to have difficult conversations, like there's a fear, like something dangerous is going to happen, like just this deep seated, like, wow, violence can come up, or like conflict means violence, and I want to avoid like difficult, uncomfortable conversations. It could be about losing connection, don't want to, right? And but often I wonder if it's at its root, often when people avoid a difficult conversation, it's just this sort of fear, the fear of something, some sense of harm happening to us. Does that resonate, do you think?
So neurobiologically, there's a link between anger and fear. Anger is made to elicit fear. That's the whole point of anger.
Yeah, right. Anger is made to elicit fear. Okay. Yeah.
Loud voice, big gestures, sometimes violence. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to make people afraid. So if what we've primarily experienced is anger that has not been mitigated by care and love, where people have not tied into their ferocious capacity for passionate advocacy, then they've scared their children, they've scared their partners. Those people got into the world and are scared of anger because it was effing scary. Fear is supposed to get us away from anger.
Fear is supposed to get us away from anger. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we imagine a conflicted situation and the other person's response and we imagine anger, then we want to go away.
So yeah, when it's about having conversation, difficult, challenging conversations, and wanting to navigate skillfully those conversations, right? We're really working with the fear and the anger circuits together. Yeah.
Maybe, but sometimes the anger is in somebody's past rather than in the present. I mean, a lot of the time, what you're working with a nervous system in sympathetic activation cannot tell what year it is. It cannot tell the difference between person A and a father. When we're in sympathetic activation, the amygdala is running the show. It doesn't know.
Yeah.
It has no idea.
Yeah.
So part of what you're doing with your empathy, with our empathy, is we are inviting the nervous system to come out of sympathetic activation so that things can begin to be differentiated.
There are three systems that you named. There's the seeking, the play, and the sexuality. So all three of those that can block us to move forward. And if we can attend to those circuits
Blocked play doesn't usually block us from moving forward.
Oh, it doesn't. Okay.
No, it usually blocks us from having joy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where would you put that in these different, as I kind of metaphorically label these different territories? Where would play still be in that realm somehow, or would it be, does that circuit, where would that be useful to
In
think
terms
about?
of your
My kind of framework?
of your framework, I think it would be sympathetic activation. It would show up as sarcasm and mean jokes early in a conflict process, or as a complete lack of a sense of humor. That would be the kernel of frozen play that you would run into, like a dogged insistence on logical, factual, just the facts, ma'am, kind of response. That's a frozen play. Activated play, it comes with meanness often, well, with predatory aggression. When you're in a conflict situation, you know, the fight, flight is, alarmed aloneness is pretty intense, and the predatory aggression comes out to try to protect from that. And then sympathetic activation, you would experience as people begin to really laugh. And you would say, nervous systems are starting to come online.
So it's more of it's not so much something you try to activate it. It's just an indicator when there is more safety and connection and trust.
Unless you're, mediating with a couple where one of them needs the other to not be so emotionally dead, then you're in the realm of needing to find ways to actually work with the play circuit. I can see where that would be an issue in couples work.
Okay. But what you said about the sexuality circuit, that was really profound, actually, that how that relates to our
authenticity,
and how that relates to moving into the future and moving towards what we want and authentically know that we love and want. And you gave me a deeper understanding of that, and I love that, and how key, and then how that works. It sounds like with the seeking circuit too, right? And So cool. Okay. I think there's so much knowledge that you have your mastery in, that it's like, whew, wow. But I think I'm getting at least parts of it. And the last little territory, we can just touch on it slightly, but it's the conversation where it's about hurt. So a different kind of emotion of hurt and the reconciliation healing process. So Marshall came up with this sort of reconciliation healing model. To me, it's another territory of when the conflict is about hurt rather than about a clash of strategies and fear about, differences, basically. So instead, it's more about the hurt and the pain that we carry that gets activated. So is that different than anger and fear driving a conflict?
Well, yeah, hurt is alarmed aloneness.
Ah,
Yeah. And it's often the receipt of perceived predatory aggression. It's not necessarily predatory aggression because, as Marshall said, people are just trying to meet needs. They're not out there. He didn't say this, but I'm riffing on it. People are just trying to meet needs. They're not out there trying to hurt you. But because of the way our brains work, we believe that people are deliberately trying to hurt us. So often it's a perceived sense that predatory aggression is a part of the situation.
okay. And there's the hurt, feeling hurt by that aggression, that kind of aggression towards us. Yeah. And that is tied then into, you're saying, the grief? No, the seeking? No, I'm getting confused. Well, what did you say about that in terms of the grief?
Panic, grief, and blame. What do you believe that someone has done intentionally or intentionally abdicated choice about? Is one of the questions that can lead to a fairly precise sense of what the essence of the hurt is.
Is there a distinction with hurt that is more tied to the anger rage circuit versus hurt that's tied to the grief?
Each of the circuits has a different movement. Anger is sort of from the front of the body out, away. Disgust is from inside the body out. Fear is, let's get the heck away.
Yeah.
Play is, goof, goof, goof. Panic grief is reaching. We're reaching in panic grief.
Reaching for somebody?
Someone. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with hurt, then, when we ask, what has someone done that seems to you to be intentional, or that they've intentionally abdicated choice about, and they say, my husband had an affair. He's if he didn't do it intentionally, he's abdicating choice. He's left me. That can be a defense. It depends on the person, right? It can be a defensive territory and anger. It can be, and it can also be, don't leave me. You've left me. So it depends on the person and what their experience was, what kind of hurt it is. And we can have hurt because people have scared us. Like if somebody is having a blackout drinking experience and they scare us, we can be hurt because we didn't matter to them. It can start out as blows and anger and movement of the fist, and it can turn into reaching when we begin to bring the empathy to the experience. Yeah.
To bring that level of understanding to conflict, how we get in conflict, what's happening on the emotional circuitry and the hemispheres and the neurotransmitters and just that there's such richness of like really getting what's happening there. And then that can help so much in bringing in the empathy and activating the care and getting the prefrontal cortex work, all of that you've talked about. Just so helpful, really, to understand this, the kind of understanding you're bringing.
I was so glad. It's so fun to talk with you.
Yeah, it's really fun. You're making me realize how much I don't know more knowing more that I don't know. But this is great to give lots of ideas about how to relate to this territory of conflict and neuroscience and the healing of our
And the pharmacy of
and the
needs.
pharmacy. Yes, the pharmacy. Yes. Anything else you want to say about? It's been a little while since we talked about the larger social world and the challenges we're facing. Are you familiar by chance with the othering and belonging work of John Powell and all that? Are you? Yeah.
Yeah. Creating and connection across differences. I mean, this stuff is important. This is working with the country, working with the world as one brain.
Say more about that. That's just as one brain. That's very intriguing. Can you just expand a little more there? That was
Sure. So it's really fun to begin to think about neurons as people and people as neurons, and whichever emotional state they're in, then the pharmacy of needs, of feelings and needs, can begin to kind of bring the soothing packets of regulation to one person's brain. I mean, that's what words are doing. Words are neurotransmitters. Words are delivery agents for neurotransmitters.
wow.
Yeah. So each person then, as we create connections across differences, we're creating more and more integrated national brains and more integrated global brains. And
so that we become the medicine, or we become the pharmacology for the brain. Yeah.
Our words bring the gamma aminobutyric acid that calms the amygdala, the GABA that calms the amygdala and says, oh yes, sweetheart, you make sense.
Yes. Wow, Sarah. Well, this was I felt almost like a psychedelic experience at times talking with you about all this. Welcome back to the Mediate Your Life podcast. It has been such a pleasure and an honor, really, to have you with me previously, and your willingness to come back to do it just a little bit more on something personal example from me. We were looking at the different, I call them territories in the world of human conflict and different processes to navigate those territories. And we were talking about the neuroscience and Jaak Panksepp's work related to those different regions. And but I thought of today a situation of mine to just go into more depth with one of those particular territories. Yeah, so I thought about how I wanted to do this, what I wanted to say, and yet there's, as I mentioned in our before I pressed record, that there's some nervousness I'm feeling in sharing this, and it's a very deep and tender place, and I can't imagine a person I would more feel safe and good doing this with, but it is pretty public. So there was something that happened somewhat recent. It's been some weeks now. I was presenting in a program. I was like a guest at and I got some feedback afterwards that was really, really challenging. And it was sort of shocking and took me by a lot of surprise and sort of triggered some challenging things inside to deal with. And I was looking at what of my different processes and in this sort of Mediate Your Life framework would I use. And one of them is, and we talked about it before, you and I call it resilience with feedback. So when we're getting a certain kind of feedback from the world, and sometimes or anytime that can be triggering. And I think we talked about how, in terms of the emotion circuitry, Jaak Panksepp's work, so where fear can be about the anxiety of panic and alarmed aloneness, and shame, there's way more nuance that of this territory than I do. But anyway, that's how I sort of think of when we're receiving maybe judgments of others or feedback, and we're trying to process, not necessarily in the moment, maybe in the moment, but often afterwards, and kind of working through maybe a shame response. And that was definitely a lot of that coming up big time. So I was like, oh, okay, I want to use this map, this process, to kind of work my way through it. And so it's borrowing from a terminology, NVC terminology, mourn, celebrate, learn. So I think I want to just give a little more detail of like go through each, especially that first process with you. But I want to try to capture something useful for others to learn, sort of share with people who watch this, and especially with your kind of perspective on it. In terms of the first step of taking the sort of the comments that I read about people's disappointment or judgment, and the way that it was worded, it triggered maybe we could use this just to talk more deeply about shame.
Sure.
You have so much, in terms of how the brain works and the neuroscience of this, but just, with me as the
Yeah.
focus of it, right? While I was working through this, I happened to, a family friend was an EMDR trauma therapist and did some work. And I went back I've never used that approach before, that methodology. And I went to this place of my, and I don't know that I've shared this with you. My mom, committed suicide when I was 5. There was an affair. There was separation with my dad. There was then her going through a psychotic break period for like a year, and then she took her life.
You lost her. Yeah.
Yeah. So that I've known about that tendency for a long time of a child to take on, it's my fault that happened, right?
Exactly. How do we make sense of the world unless we do take that on? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I've always kind of said, yeah, I knew and then that sort of unworthiness or shame that goes along with thinking, like, if something's bad, if there's some disappointment or loss of connection, it's like, it's my fault. It's something bad with me. But like this situation, for the timing of it, it really, and the timing of this trauma work that I did, it took me back to the deep feeling of unworthiness and shame.
Wow.
Of receiving feedback like, I'm not good enough, I'm not enough, I should be better, I should, right? All that story. And the needs to feel worthy,
Mm-hmm.
and worthy of being who we are. I think of it in terms of my journey with this, it's like, was really like that. The shame says that it's somehow not okay who I am, need to be better. And some of the healing, the need that I got in touch with for me was that the way that I am as I am is okay. It's like, it's enough, or it's okay. And then to be able to take in the needs of the others, the people whose needs not met, and to be able to more easily just be with, oh, okay, some unmet needs, and it's not something bad or wrong with me, just unmet needs. And even if the intensity of the expression of it is difficult, that there's, so maybe I'll just pause, and just anything that you want to kind of add framing to that, with this very specific example, going into this shift to mourning unmet needs versus being in the right wrong of something, that if we're getting some kind of feedback from the world. So yeah, anything that you want to say or guide me in a little bit in this moment.
Yeah. Being in right wrong is rewarding for the brain. The brain likes to be in right wrong. It creates a cycle of kind of a looping self-consuming cycle of reward with dopamine when we're in that world of right wrong. And it's a way to cope with grief, most often grief. Blame once you start to work with it is. I imagine your experience has also been that grief will come if people work with their blame. Yeah. And but what's so interesting about shame is that we often think of shame as a primary color emotion. It's just shame. There's nothing deeper than shame. But actually, when we look at where shame shows up in the brain, it shows up in our cognition. It shows up as thought patterns rather than as feeling patterns. But it is the emotional state which gives humans the most cortisol of any. It is the most stressful emotion for humans to feel, shame. And it means that somebody has left us or that we have left ourselves. It's a cognitive expression. It's a cognitive workaround of a way to try to step into right wrong when we've been abandoned. Mm-hmm. And abandonment isn't a word we use that often in nonviolent communication. We kind of tend to try to parse it out because it has a tendency all by itself to imply that somebody is to blame, which is what we're trying to avoid even in nonviolent communication. We're trying to avoid blame or to transform blame. But shame, once we start to learn, shame is a cognition. It's me having a thinking pattern that something that I've done or said will result in my loss of connection with others or with myself or with the world, or it's a response to news that we have lost regard or connection. So when feedback has a lot of negative and dissatisfied energy in it, then it's a direct download that we have lost connection with the other person. They are no longer seeing us in our true intentions and in our truest heart. They are seeing us as something else. So this beautiful work that you did of taking you all the way back to your childhood and to this very, very big experience of alarmed aloneness, of the loss of the person who was difficult but was the most important person in your life, is a place where a child would make all kinds of meaning. Because, by definition, if our mother dies, we are unaccompanied. By definition, we're having to manage immense amounts of separation, distress, and alarmed aloneness. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, we make sense of it with shame. Shame is a way to survive. It makes me cry, but it's a way to survive unsurvivable grief.
Yes.
And loss.
Yes.
So, of course, as little ones and big ones, we all have this shame experience because it's a life fest. And then also the other thing that shame does with that flow of cortisol and the hopelessness that comes with us is it very handily turns the nervous system down from sympathetic activation into immobilization. Uh-huh. So it's life-saving in its decrease of loss of energy to something that seems irresolvable.
Yes. Yes. I don't know, sometimes really feels so good to hear you talk about it that way. Because, it's hard even. It's been a life journey to just try to process that level of emotional impact, right? And just the way you just worded that, to survive that kind of loss and traumatic.
And the alarm state that comes with the loss of a mom
Yeah.
is not survivable unless we can figure out how to turn the volume down.
To somehow dampen the intensity of so much.
Yeah.
So much intensity.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of people listening or watching, just, that kind of understanding of when we go through those kind of experiences, how the body, the brain, the body tries to cope, even with shame, how shame is such a maybe important. It's pretty painful afterwards, but during that time, it really, as you're saying, it's a lifesaver to protect us from what would just be unimaginable, just too much. Our system just sort of, not coping.
Yeah, you could say it keeps us from going insane with grief.
Insane with grief. Yeah. Yeah. Is it similar at all to, like, if an animal is being attacked, say by a larger animal, a predator or something, and it just goes limp? It goes like as a again, kind of trying to
Survive.
survive.
Yeah. As all cognitions do, it has some problems.
Some side effects.
It's pretty persistent. You can end up kind of walking around with shame being your guiding principle for the rest of your life.
Yeah, what's interesting is I have known the kind of almost theoretically, and I don't know, I've done a lot of work on it through the years in different ways, but almost it's until this opportunity, for some reason, that the timing, everything sort of came together, so the combination of it all just took me way deeper than I'd been into that, and in a way that allowed this healing of what came as a strategy kind of in the learning phase. We can also talk about how to, the moving into celebrating needs met too, but was to ask my dad a lot of questions about what happened at that time, and things I'd never asked him before. And I just spent hours with him, just like asking to try to get because the narrative I had is, oh yeah, she went crazy and that was sort of it. But then I found out there was all these ways she wasn't supported.
Yeah.
She, my brother was born soon, like 15 months after me. And then she just had very little support. And I think just things spiraled for her in all kinds of ways, and the people around her weren't able to help her and support her and understand. And so anyways, it just that strategy to ask certain questions and to reframe that whole narrative, suddenly it was like, oh, wait a minute, it wasn't like something wrong with me. The other adults in the situation didn't step up and figure out how to help her and get through that situation in a different way. And it just changed the narrative in my mind. It's like, so maybe I am. It was an interesting strategy that appeared, right? To go, to change that story from, is all something wrong with me, to, no, it's just, I was just there. And all these things were transpiring over this period of time. But the overarching process was starting with this mourning of unmet needs, and just how to go deeper and deeper into that mourning, into that grieving, into that sadness. And it took me all the way down to that place, and then ultimately to a different strategy, and a few other strategies that have come as well. So needs I've named before, but there's something about really, with the EMDR, I think, really going back and really being in that time again. Did some time travel, and just to connect with the needs separate from the story. So maybe you could say something about that too, like in NVC, how we do that, and anything you want to add from your work about, that ability to mourn our unmet needs separate from the story. Yeah. Is there anything you haven't said that you think people listening could get value that we haven't said yet?
Well, I don't think that we've talked about identity and the emergence of the authentic self. What any body of work that tames the traumatized right hemisphere and takes us into the traumatized right hemisphere and makes it a livable place. So nonviolent communication does this, EMDR does this, resonance work with its inclusion of NBC does this. And so do all of the other good things, somatic experiencing and everything. I think of all the healing modalities as segments of an orange, each of them separate and different, but joined by that white web of fiber. It goes down the middle, the core of the orange, and around the outside. Um, and so here we are with healing, which is the reclamation of previously traumatized areas of the brain, which were not organized and coherent, becoming organized and coherent, the amygdala releasing the imprints of trauma and allowing the hippocampus to make sense of our lives and contextualize our lives. So here you were making sense of your mother's life and her impact on you as something very different from the narrative that you created that helped you to survive what happened. And that's what narratives always do. They're always trying to help us survive the unsurvivable. So here we are with the emergence of the authentic self. How can we tell that we're in the authentic self? We can tell that we're in the authentic self when we know what really matters to us. And so the flavors of the needs really express a lot about what matters to us. So as we begin to tune into mourning unmet needs and celebrating the beauty of the needs, we are really moving toward an organized, coherent right hemisphere that can tell what it wants and loves, and then that allows a pathway through our difficult lives to be laid out and followed, because we're following the smell, so to speak, of the authentic self as expressed in needs energies.
Yes, just focusing on the pure need energies of security and safety and connection and love and acceptance and all those needs. To me, that's an important part of this step is if we kind of need empathy for what comes up for us first of those needs, but also then to receive the needs of others, giving feedback, right? And the needs in this case was sort of like learning and engagement and clarity and just yeah, like people really expressing these deep desires and longings. And then it just was like, oh yeah, I can like just reframe that as people, Marshall was just saying, please, wanting their needs to be met. And again, separate from a story of wrongness, but just almost like asking and desiring of like to meet needs. And that's a totally different, story, right? Yeah, so that's sort of like step one. And this was a very intense trigger or stimulus. I'm so glad you brought up about authenticity. It's like I'd seen it, but I hadn't seen it, of how much that shame and unworthiness had made it so that I wasn't worthy of authenticity. Like I was in certain ways, like to be honest, like my dad, sort of very, that value for him was always huge growing up, and to be honest and authentic in a certain way. But when it came to anything that might risk disconnection with people,
Yeah.
to want to please people and accommodate and be flexible and really adaptive to what others need and want, and like living a lot of my life that way, of so sensitive to maintaining connection and work, not being authentic, kind of more being what others want in order to, yeah, stay connected, right? And so this sense of honoring authenticity, even if it means disconnection, like I'm worth it. I'm worth like being truthful about what's alive in me, what's so for me, even if it risks disconnection. There's like a way to affirm the worthiness that was different after going through this experience. Does that make sense?
Makes so much sense.
So that place where the sacrifice of authenticity was kind of part of the strategy of staying somewhat safe in a certain way, was the sacrifice of a certain kind of authenticity, and then a way to kind of shift that. Uh, but and now if I see that shame, whenever that shame does come up, I can see, oh, that's this protective response, but it's a chance to honor what actually is true for me, even though I'm afraid of the disconnect, right? That so it feels like every time that fear, anxiety, shame comes, it's just this opportunity to embrace authenticity instead of go the other way and try to be something that I think will, make others judge me differently versus go deeper into the authenticity. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And it reminds me that as we do this work, there's a kind of a peeling away. I mean, this is a different way of talking about Rumi's field, of the field of right and wrong. That as we do this work and we sink farther into the survival structures that we created as little ones in order to, of course, manage difficult worlds that we were living in, we can find ourselves beginning to question the idea of mistakes at all. Like that there just is no such thing, you know? I mean, I think about something simple like when I was a little girl and I used to get, instead of 100% on my math test, I was first or second grade, it was arithmetic test, I would get 80% or 90%. And my father would be despairing. He would be like, I can't believe it. You know this material. Why did you mess up these questions? You're not being careful. You're not going back. You're not checking your answers. And for me, doing the test didn't meet needs. Other things met needs for me. Imaginative thought, daydreaming. There were all kinds of things that I needed to be doing, which were not the math test. And there was a way that it was impossible for my father to enter my world because he was valuing 100%. He was valuing adherence to authority over the needs that I had. So for so long I thought, oh, I've made mistakes. I'm careless. I don't, this was my father's story about me. You're careless. You don't care. You're not, you don't put the time, you're lazy. You don't put the time and energy in to making it flawless, And then as I was doing this work, all of a sudden there was like this kind of funny peeling away of the idea that my father was right and that I was wrong, or that anyone else who tells anyone else, about right. I mean, obviously we can harm each other so badly. And that's, tragic expressions of trauma. And we need a lot of help and healing in order to hopefully, be able to kind of catch our out of control cart and get it steered out of the way of harming other people, for God's sake. That sense of right and wrong just begins to fray as we do, just begins to fray and dissolve, so that when we're face to face with, people wanting different strategies from us, we can, sort of listen deeply. Again, you had mentioned that this is what you had done. You had stripped away a sense of right or wrong, and you were like in there going, okay, is there information in this feedback that is actually usable to me? Is there a sense, and this is the other very interesting thing about feedback, especially for teaching, is that you have 90% of the class that's completely satisfied and perfectly happy with the way you're doing it. Then you get feedback from 10%. If you're changing in response to the feedback of 10%, you're leaving the silent 90% behind as well. So it's a very tricky thing to begin to find our way. And I think it requires our body to be in the game, kind of feeling the feedback. Is there something here that I can do without losing my authenticity? Is this feedback nourishing, generative? Is there an invitation in it for me?
Yes. Interesting how you talked about your father. My father also like that, actually, very similar about making mistakes and just very similar things he would say. Yeah, so being able to though take whatever the value in the feedback once like peeling away all that wrongness to it and just what people were wanting, and then going to the really deepening into the celebration part. I went back and looked, and there were a lot of ways I was being very authentic and very kind of my style. And yeah, it wasn't my best day, but it was very authentic, and there was a willingness to be fairly vulnerable. And then for some people it didn't work for them, and but that was something I could kind of appreciate and celebrate uh, in that experience. So there's the learning afterwards, which is like the third step, right? And we've been talking about some of that. Oh, and I saw as I looked, there was like warmth, and there was genuine like caring for people, and being gentle with people, and being soft and inviting and warm and all. So there are things, especially as I went back and I could look and see that there were a lot of things about that experience that I could celebrate, as well as, yeah, I could really mourn how for some people it didn't meet some of their needs, and how all that triggered in me, but things I could really kind of enjoy and appreciate about the experience, and just the even like the opportunity to share my approach with things, and what I found so valuable, and then even to give some feedback myself about the experience, and afterwards. So anyways, there were things. So just for people listening, watching, that like how we can mourn deeply into unmet needs, we can also really connect to needs met and celebrate that, and kind of feel that upliftment of the almost like a joy of met needs, while still holding the balance of really, yeah, still mourning unmet needs, but there's like kind of a just holding the two together. I think one of my biggest learnings was letting people know how I want, what my sort of style is. And this was a group of people that didn't really know me. And I'm used to being with people that sort of know me from the beginning, and they're part of a training program. And this was stepping into a very different audience in a way. And just to be able to help people kind of know what to expect, manage expectations, right? And I've never been that great at that. But that was big, that there is a way to help people kind of orient to what I'm going to give them, maybe different than they're expecting in certain kind of ways. That was a huge learning. And then just this learning we've talked about around when there is shame, to sort of see it as an opportunity to try to share even more authentically, honor what is alive in me as something that's valuable, and it's okay. It's like okay to be me. And each of us kind of need, that's a deep need, to feel like who we are is good. It's okay to be exactly who we are. Just to associate starting to get that fear, anxiety, shame with, oh, here's an opportunity to step in, to be authentic, as a kind of honoring of worthiness instead of unworthiness. And then retelling the story of my childhood in a very different narrative. That was another profound learning. Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah. So I think that was the main thing. I wanted to just come back and go deep into a particular process with this kind of example. Was there anything else you want to reflect on?
Just to say that part of what we see happening in your brain is that the being able to touch into feelings and needs allows the amygdala's messages to be received in a way that completes them. Then the amygdala starts to calm, and when it starts to calm, then in the presence of that stimulus, it's actually, when we hit a trauma stimulus, the amygdala creates a flow of cortisol again that takes the hippocampus out. It just obliterates the workings of the hippocampus. So what we see is that the empathy calms the amygdala, and the amygdala relaxes in the presence of the stimulus, the hippocampus can start to work. The brain's librarian, tracker, contextualizer can start to work. And all of a sudden, new understandings of our life narrative begin to happen. And this is the coordination that happens with trauma work, with the presence of solid, beautiful, alive empathy skills. Is that it physically transforms the way that energy and information are traveling in the brain and where they are stored. And so your hippocampus gets to go, now, I'm going to go talk to my dad and get all this info. I'm going to put it all into place. I'm going to make sense of my life and my mother's life, which you got to do because the amygdala got to become calm enough in the presence of the needs, energies, and the identification and resonance with feelings. So I wanted to celebrate that and name it explicitly, since it's such a beautiful example of contextualizing and meaning making. And this is what we will hear over and over again when people do deep processes like your process, where they go, oh, now I understand something I never understood before.
You reminded me of just one last thing, maybe about how I did a follow-up EMDR session with this same person, and we did a time travel where I went back to the service, the funeral service for my mom. It was open casket, and I have these I don't have a lot of memories from my childhood because of, as a protection, but I do remember being at that church. I remember going up and touching her cheek. And so we went back there in the EMDR session and but as an adult, and you do this all the time, so maybe you can speak a little bit to how whatever you want to say about it. But as I traveled back in time and was like, oh, I'm this adult, but I'm there with my 5-year-old self. I'm sitting in the pew, I also remember sitting outside right after, but it's like right in that time period, in when the service was, and being with my little self and tending, being really empathic and present and warm and caring and supportive and just like changing the memories, like that we can go back in time, even though it's this time, but still internally going back and being with that small self with this adult self, and just being there in a way that none of the adults still knew. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to help these little, me and my little brother, but I do now. I could internally travel back and in memory be as if it was happening right in the moment. It's a weird kind of it's almost like a movie where where they play with time. Is there anything you want to say about that to people?
Well, it's really important to bring your NVC, feelings and needs guesses, with you when you go, because so many people go back in time, and if they don't remember their feelings and needs guesses, then they start telling their inner child what they feel. They'll say, or offering reassurance instead of resonance. So they're like, you're going to be okay, which is a coded kind of resonance guess of, do you need some acknowledgement that you don't feel like you're going to be okay? Which is then allows for a dialogue. The thing that the questions do, the MBC questions, are you feeling because you're needing, it allows a dialogue to develop where new information can come out. If you time travel and you just tell your child all this stuff without download, without any openness and receptivity to what messages need to be received, then you're not allowing for the completion of the circuit between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And there's lots of things that get missed. So we still miss things when we're doing an MVC kind of dialogue, but not as much as we would miss if we said, Sarah, little Sarah, you're going to be okay. Come on home with me. And then there's something very sweet about this sentence. I have come back for you because you were too alone. And I don't want you to be this alone anymore. It's a very sweet expression. And I'm here to tell you, you survived this. I am living proof. Would you like to come home with me? That's all kinds of expression and love and tenderness being expressed, and not no longer NBC empathy, but it's a very sweet sentence to remember for those times when we are traveling to our little ones.
Yes. Yeah, I'm really glad you emphasized the feelings, the guesses, that just giving space to listen and to hear, and not to just try to reassure or say, but to really leave space, like even in time travel, even in our inner work with ourselves, right? Just still same principles of listening and being open to what is true for, in this case, these little ones, and that inside of us that just want to talk about maybe their experience, or just be with their experience and allow it to. Yeah, I like what you said, just on a neurological level, what's needed to complete that maybe gets stepped over if you just reassure too quickly, and things we're tempted to do, but don't fully allow the processing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad you added that. Yeah. Yeah. But this was great to be able to go back and do this with you. And thank you so much, Sarah,
Mm.
for being willing. And so maybe something that we could end this on is, if what you want people to know about your work, in the sense of if they want to connect with what you're doing right now, or anything you haven't already said, like at the beginning, which was a
Mm-hmm.
while ago now, but anything in this moment, that an ending that you want people to know about,
Yeah.
you and your work, and anything you want people to know.
Most particularly, I want people to know that we have an annual resonance summit, a resonant healing summit, that happens every year, where we bring neuroscientists and people who are practitioners of resonance and nonviolent communication empathy. And this year it's from April 3 to 6. And it's an amazing experience. It's free of charge. And we bring neuroscientists and invite people from all over the world to present about how, and to offer experiential workshops that let people begin to feel into exactly the kinds of things that you and I are describing here today.
Yeah, I attended that last year. It was wonderful. So I highly recommend that to everybody who watches this. And yeah, and so people go to your website, yeah, sarahpeyton.com.
SarahPeyton.com. The sign up for the summit is not on as of today,
But April, it's
but
coming in
it's
April.
coming up, and I think it'll be the sign up for the summit. The registration link will be up in mid-February.
Okay, great. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been a real delight to be with you this much. Such a gift. And thank you for all the incredible work you're doing, the service you're giving to humanity that needs a lot of trauma healing, as we can still very much see in the world.
We do. I've been specially studying this year the links between corporal punishment and conservative politics. I may have said that the last time we were together, because I've been thinking about it for 6 months or so.
Yeah, well, we're in early 2025 right now, and there's a lot coming.
A lot of impact
Starting soon.
from how we're treating our children and what happens in their adult lives as they grow up and have power.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. Lots and lots of love to you, and good wishes on everything you're up to. And we will be in touch.
Wonderful.
So take good care.
You too.
Thank you for listening to today's conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe to the Mediate Your Life podcast, and follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram at John Kenyon. You can also download the Mediate Your Life app to practice these principles in your own life. With love, empathy, and care, I'm John Kenyon. Thank you for listening.